So this talk was originally done for the Isle of Man Victorian Society, and that's because the Victorian Society focus an awful lot on people who are worthy of merit. Their newsletter has lots of content about innovative people worthy of mention. Their newsletter has lots of content on the built environment and the worthy clients, architects, surveyors and builders. But what about the less visible classes, those who have left little trace of their activities and lives? And where can they be found as you move around the island? So the reason I'm showing this picture, this is just me in fancy dress. There's no other reason for it really. I've always been interested in social history and how people live and how they die, what they do, what they think, what they care about. I'm also really interested in revisionism, so going back and looking at the history of our past with fresh eyes, using today's values to take another look at things. I also like to look at social histories and particularly people who fall between the cracks. One of the things that I love about studying history is the fact that things don't really change that much at all. Lots of society's problems are the same now as they've always been. So how does a look at the past, what does it look like when we reframe history to look at it from a feminist view or with a focus on mental illness, race? What about gay or Romani history? These people are harder to research as they're not in the spotlight. An easy example is that wealthier people can afford a headstone, which is a lasting record of their existence, but the cost to a poor family might make that impossible. I set out to see if I could find some traces of the marginalised unworthies to talk to you about, people who've been called the residuum or the underclass. I'm not seeking to shock or outrage. I'm going to use the language of the time and won't be swapping the old terms for modern politically correct terminology, so please don't be offended. I've confined my research mainly to the Victorian era, having done a lot of research particularly in the World War I period. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about legislation, but mainly I want to share stories with you about real people, which seems appropriate for the Family History Society, really. Churches are hugely commemorative places. They commemorate the great and the good. These people are remembered with the biggest memorials, plaques and stained glass windows. The gravestones of the poor are found sinking into the earth, if they had a stone, of course. The church is a fantastic institution for the administration of charity, or what they called alms. I'm not knocking philanthropy, but I must admit I was quite shocked when I went to a talk about the slave trade, John Manley over there, and I realised that money left to the poor via the churchwardens of Ballaugh was earned by the exploitation of African slaves. Thomas Corlett of Ballaugh made a fortune at sea in the so-called Guinea trade. He could not have been ignorant of the human cargo that he helped transport. It could be viewed as a poisoned chalice, and this is the crux of the objection to the celebration of great acts of philanthropy. But of course, the prevailing view was that the black man was other and less human than white people. I am glad that things have changed, even in my lifetime. My nana described the colour of her slacks as a certain shade of brown, which involved the use of the N-word. Not acceptable nowadays, and that's with very good reason. Places on the Isle of Man are named after all sorts of posh people. We have our big grand houses, terraces and squares, although they're not a patch on some of those across the water. Examples for us are things like Taubman Terrace, Harris Terrace, Loch Promenade, Hildersley, Derby and Athol, anything. My inspiration for this talk was A.W. Moore's Manx Worthies, which is a marvellous piece of work. And I'm going to quote now from the book, which will illustrate what A.W. Moore saw as some of its limitations. He said, "Many men have led the most useful and blameless lives, and yet they do not afford interesting material for even the briefest biography." He also said, I wish to point out that the comparative lengths of the notices given are, in most cases, regulated by the information available and not by the importance of the subject. He also said, we are able to record the names of a greater number of worthies under the first two headings, Army and Navy, rather than under any other. This is not, of course, because their careers as soldiers and sailors were more distinguished than those of Manxmen whose occupations lay in other fields, but simply because military and naval services are necessarily conspicuous and therefore more likely to be recorded. Here, Arthur, I completely agree with all that. He's acknowledging that it's the posh people that's going to get in, really. I would argue that for the majority of people mentioned in this book, a degree of family money would be required to get them started on their career path, to gain an education at least. For example, lots of those educated at the charitable mathematical school at Peel, which closed in 1892. A good education could elevate a boy's chance at social mobility, and thankfully, we know that lots of wealthy people sponsored poor boys to attend the school as well. Can everybody hear, by the way? Yeah? Good. So, let's have a think about some of those other people. The study of poverty and its prevalence and all of the causes is fascinating, as is the history of philanthropy, or what we might now call charitable giving. Often in the old newspapers, subscribers to every appeal or annual subscription were listed so that their philanthropy could be noted and admired by others. Of course, giving to the poor was part of one's Christian duty. This fella here, Samuel Smiles, is my favourite writer on poverty. He was a newspaper journalist and an author, and in his day job he was a railway company secretary, and he came from Scotland. He promoted the idea that more progress would come from new attitudes than from new laws. His primary work was called Self-Help, published in 1859, and it promoted thrift and claimed that poverty was largely caused by irresponsible habits, but he also attacked materialism and laissez-faire government, or governments basically that took no responsibility for less fortunate citizens. Smiles was one of 11 children. He left school at 14 and was apprenticed to a doctor. His father died in an 1832 cholera epidemic, but Smiles was unable to continue with his studies because he was supported by his mother, who ran a small shop. She was a firm believer that the Lord will provide, and her example of working ceaselessly to support herself and his 9 younger siblings strongly influenced Samuel's life, and he developed a benign and tolerant outlook, unlike an awful lot of other people who blamed poverty very, very firmly on the poor for their own ills. But there's always been lots of interesting ideas about the causes of poverty. Henry Mayhew was a journalist who studied the London poor and co-founded Punch magazine. He wrote a series of books called London Labour and the London Poor, and he classified poor people under 3 separate categories. People who they will work, they can't work, or they won't work. It's interesting that the UK has contemporary concerns over the huge amount of people over 50 who aren't in work since COVID, but also the quantity of youngsters who struggle with anxiety and depression and that aren't in the workplace. We would classify them as being in the can't work category, largely because ageism still exists, of course, and a lot of people over 50 have responsibility as carers too. And we wouldn't want our young people forced into work by the removal of benefits if they were suffering from severe anxiety, but I doubt very much that the Victorians would agree with our modern sensibilities. Other figures such as Dickens wrote about the underclass, and other people like the Quakers, like Joseph Rowntree in York. The Quakers, of course, were great philanthropists, but also they provided brilliant facilities in order to get the best out of their workers. Here on the screen, you'll see statistics from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on recent poverty in the UK. Methods to analyse poverty are constantly updated. But does anything really change? Those statistics are quite shocking, really. And is it worse being in poverty now than it was then, or the other way around? But anyway, poverty still hasn't gone away. So, the scandal of the poor. In the archives of the Manx Museum, I found the text of a talk by Pat Skillicorn called Pennies for the Poor. Pat actually taught me history at QE2 and was a huge influence on me. In the talk, Pat explained that there was no formal provision on the Isle of Man. There was no poor law, as there had been in England since Elizabethan times. The church gave money, of course, via the vicar and wardens of each parish, and there were societies and groups formed for charitable giving, with committees in Ramsey and Castletown. There was the House of Industry, houses for widows, soup kitchens in Douglas and Ramsey, and there was also the Home for Destitute Children. But by the 1870s, things were beginning to change. A commission was set up to look into what could be done about poverty and health in the Isle of Man. So, much like today's government roadshow, they set up the 1879 Commission, and the inquiry travelled around the Isle of Man collecting evidence. And I'm going to read you a quote from a fella called Mr. R.J. Moore of Peel. And he said, "There is a regular system here, and has been, as so far as my recollection goes back, say upwards of 40 years, of house-to-house begging. A large number take Saturday as their raiding day, and droves of them go from house to house. They do not all belong to Peel. A good many of them come in from the country. Many come from Douglas. I could not give you anything like an idea of the amount of those roving beggars, the amount the roving beggars receive, but I can tell you that they get at my house, and I have no doubt that many other persons in Peel give quite as much. To start, there's 18 who come to my house every Saturday, and they get a penny." So you can see how some people were beginning to get a bit fed up of beggars and poor people wandering around asking for charity. And you can see here on the examples on the screen, there's a lady who lives with a son who claims benefits for a charity, but he doesn't actually do anything. He could keep her himself, but he doesn't bother. A lady here who's getting double bubble, like you could say. She's obviously learning disabilities. She's getting casual relief from the thing. She's looked after by someone else. She's getting wages. She's going begging, and then she's bringing it home to her mistress. And then again, we see people here who are in Santon, who are having people coming from Douglas by train to beg. So what worried people really was an abuse of the systems, people taking advantage of multiple forms of charity, and also taking advantage of people's goodwill. In London, they had a society called the Mendicity Society, who used to investigate individuals and take them before the magistrates, and they actually used to literally chuck them out of the city. So Manx people were worried about these sort of things. To put it into context, the House of Industry, which is now the Ellen Vannin Home, had been there since 1832, and in the 1881 census it had 67 residents. The Widow's House on Cambrian Place had 12 residents, Almshouse Lane had 2, and Graves Widow's House on Clark Street had 7, plus of course all these wandering beggars. So what was to be done? Well, they decided to set up a proper poorhouse, and they built one at Braddon, which opened in 1889. Facilities were provided for males and females with separate staircases. There were some married quarters, and children up to the age of 8 could be accommodated there. Interestingly, a day room was set apart for, and I quote, able-bodied female paupers of the least deserving class. In other words, those of the pauper class who have become poor through their own folly. Another room was, and I quote again, for the most deserving poor, those who have not become impoverished through any fault of their own. A distinction which is finely but generally drawn, though it is sometimes difficult to define. So, how do you decide who's deserving and who's not? The poor asylum was designed to accommodate 150 people, with the aim being to empty the House of Industry. There was one servant employed and inmates were expected to do all the other work. I have no idea how this was supposed to work, and I can't imagine that it ever did. Criminal women absolutely hated the poor asylum, and from research that I did around 1902, they would prefer to go to jail. So, of course, lots of beggars did not want to go there either. So, let's talk about some specific groups of Manx Unworthies. Oh, sorry, there's a picture of the poor house. Anybody here with Irish blood running in the veins?
Yes.
Yeah, Irish born, yeah?
Not Irish, Ulster.
Okay, so I'm not discriminating against Irish people. I just want to make that clear. But this is some of the stuff that was said about them. So the Medical Aid and Poor Relief Commission that I was talking about in 1879, the Irish were blamed for teaching the Manx to beg. Can you believe that? You can see the quote. You can see the quote here. This photograph, by the way, which has been annotated by John James Froude, is entitled Little Ireland or Little Hell, and shows Shaw's Brow area of Douglas. In his papers is a description of an excursion around Old Douglas, and he says, Thornhill, between Barrack Street and Shaw's Brow, is a little congeries of little dwellings to which access is had by means of several flights of steps. The district is known by the names of Little Ireland and Little Hell. The Thornhill area of Douglas was named after the owner of the land, who was called William Callister, and he was the MHK of Ayr, and he lived at Thornhill in Lazaire, which was why it was called Thornhill. So, more bad mouthing of Irish. This statistics here in this newspaper article talks about the number of drunk and disorderly offences, and 128 of them are said to be caused by the Irish compared to 323, which seems quite high. But having said that, I always reflect in June after TT week. It's always a bit embarrassing how many of the drunk and disorderlies are Manx when you think of how many TT visitors we get. So yeah, that's kind of just one of those, isn't it, really? This is also the Shaw's Brow area of Douglas. And I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the Folklife Survey. I'm sure you're all aware of it, but I'm going to describe to you what it actually is, which I rely on heavily for the next section. The aim of the Folklife Survey was to record as much as possible of the life and crafts of the Manx community before the present century. It was commenced in 1950. The survey was to build up a picture of Manx traditional life as it survived 50 years ago and earlier. We aim to gather a mass of unrecorded information about buildings, crafts, tools and utensils, agriculture and fishing, dress and ornament, customs and beliefs, together with details of the people then alive and incidents in their lives. We are not concerned with the formal and official aspect of the island's past history, with the laws and constitution and public events and historical figures. That's really good. So this image here, just to reflect on it, I'm really pleased it has the picture of the van and the little kids, because it just gives you an idea of the scale, doesn't it, of the size of them buildings. This is the view that goes down. That would be the top of Station Hill there, Peel Road. So let's talk a bit more about extracts from the Folklife Survey. So I don't know if you can read them, but Richard Kegg of Balaff describes some paths running through the village. And he says, these were the paths the beggarmen and women were walking onto the farms. Some were Manx, but most were Irish. I can remember seeing as many 5 at one time coming along. Mrs. Neal from Ballagarrett said, at one time people would not get the poor money unless they went to church. So here we see a way of regulating who got the church charity. Not helpful if you were a Catholic perhaps and didn't want to go to the regular church. Mr. and Mrs. Convig said, there was lots of Irish fellows. They were cheeky too, as he reports how his mother always used to give to them, but one day she'd run out of change and she got a load of lip for her trouble. Miss Qualtrough reported that, and she says, the Irish were unpopular, and then she describes an Irish woman who married a Manxman. She could make beautiful clothes, but she said there were children unkempt and neglected, hens inside and outside, but she sat with her embroidery in the midst of it all. Now, those of you who've ever used the Folklife Survey will know that there's lots of red marks like this you can see here where they've tried to sort of censor it a little bit, and it often says don't use or don't use this nickname, but they've not said anything. Miss Qualtrow's bad-mouthing this poor Irish woman who's trying to do her embroidery and keep the kids quiet to earn a crust, and there's no censorship going on there. So the next image is of a beggar's house. This is at Bellellan. A man says, in the Carusia's Bellellan, there was a room in the house where beggars used to get a night's lodging. Oh, hang on, no, this is Ballachuan. Do apologise. This is Ballachuan in Maloo, and this photograph was taken in 1976. Mr. Carush of Bellellan Mackle describes how beggars slept in the barn or cow house after leaving their matches in the dwelling house. That was important. There was another beggar's house at Bellellan. In the Carusia's Bellellan, there was a room in the house where the beggars used to get a night's lodging. One of the Quayle family of Bellellan used to wear a coat made of sheepskin, and he went to a house in Mackle as a beggar. They were very poor in those days. Many farms were mortgages. He had a bulldog set on him, and he put his hand in its mouth and killed it. He was a tough character. Mrs. Watterson says, there was a beggar's house at Ballacrint, Colby, that was. I helped fell it. There is still a bit of the old wall there yet. Mr. Kermode of the How illustrates how beggars had a social function in that they carried the newses from one parish to the next. The small bits of information not available at the parish church or from the newspapers, but the skeet, how were the crops growing, and what concerns did farmers have in other parishes. Mrs. Quayle describes a hierarchy of beggars. So she describes this beggar who was entertaining and trustworthy. He was called Enfidder, and he was always welcomed and never expected to do anything on the farm, but was given an honoured seat at the fireside. He had a domicile in every parish and went nowhere else. Like the old minstrel, he would sit at the fireside surrounded by the house, and was the joy of my great-grandfather who was blind. Yet other beggars were deemed untrustworthy and simple, what we may describe nowadays as having learning disabilities, and were also subject to ridicule. The Irish are also mentioned here as well. Poor old Irish. So there were old men and women going around, and when they came to Ballamore, they were always provided with something, a meal or flour, perhaps meat if we had killed a beef. Mrs. Quilliam said, in grandfather's time, they had beggars calling at Ballagilbert. They never sent them away without something, a handful of meal perhaps for their beggar's bowl. Mrs. Kegg of Lenbridge said, the beggars were taking the meal they were given and bringing it up to Andress, and there was a woman kept a shop there, an old lady, and she would buy it for a copper or two and resell it. Someone from Glenroy says, the only person I remember coming was a Mrs. Gant. She was Louisa Corkle's mother, and when she came to the house, she would be going away with a bit of oatmeal or some pork or a bit of salt beef. If there was nothing in that line to give her, she might get a bit of money instead. Now, I love the Folklife Survey, and this is a brilliant example to me. Miss Watterson here, if you can see. I'm sorry it's a little bit fadey for you, but she brilliantly describes two female beggars. Mrs. Collins was a beggar who made her weekly call. She walked from Castletown. She was reckoned a decent woman, always clean. In summer she wore a print bonnet, a small grey shoulder shawl with a begown and black top skirt. In the winter she wore a rather high-looking bonnet with jet trimmings and the ties of black ribbon left untied. A large grey fringed shawl and elastic-sided boots, also a print check apron. He had plenty of layers on. And another one. there was another called Betty Walk Nice. See our illustration there? Yeah. She was a very quick walker and wore her skirts above her ankle, which was unusual. She lifted her feet high as she walked because they could be seen, hence the name. You'd never get that sort of detail from any other document. This piece on characters has a lot to say on beggars and people with learning disabilities too, I'd say. There's comments about them telling the newses and the fire risks associated with letting them sleep in haylofts, but also the fear of rejected beggars setting fires out of spite. So if you didn't give them something nice, you had to worry about your barn being on fire. I love paragraph 9 in this, and I quote, "Another well-known individual was very partial to a smook, and the pipe he used was a small clay one. On the other hand, when any person offered him a charge of tobacco, he had another one with a bowl as big as a teacup." Sometimes these tramps or travelling musicians would feign a quarrel and fight each other, always taking great care not to hurt each other. A large crowd would gather and someone would pass the hat around. It's a bit risky, isn't it, really? A religious tramp is reported here, and again I quote, "He was a very religious man and frequently attended the old-fashioned revival meetings at which he gave vent to his emotional feeling in no uncertain manner. Some of the brethren tried to quieten him and promised that if he contained himself, they would give him a double helping of broth when he called next. He held himself in check for a while until it became too much for him, and he sprang to his feet and cried with redoubled energy, 'Broth or no broth, glory be to God.'" There is no doubt that the Manx had a special set-up for rural beggars, and the Folklife Survey sets this out beautifully. It does make me wonder how far the questions asked of the participants determined the answers. They generally sound kind and generous, and whether it was them presenting themselves and their family in a good light is something we will never know. It seems sure that beggars were common and not always unwelcome. I also get the definite impression that tramping the roads was a lifestyle choice for many, if not for most of these beggars. So let's talk about a few more classes of ne'er-do-wells and unworthies. So our prisons on the Isle of Man, you know, they were all in Peel Castle to begin with, and then they would be down in Castle Rushen, and then they decided they would build a new prison. And the prison on Victoria Road was state-of-the-art, and it was the first prison in Britain to have gas lighting, and it opened in 1891. Some information about the new prison made it sound quite luxurious, and there was some sarcasm in the press here, where it is rumoured in town that the individual who was lucky enough to be the first to occupy a cell in the new prison will receive a watch and chain. I have no idea whether this actually took place, but yes, they thought it was far too good for them. For these criminals, they should be housed, instead of having central heating and gas lighting and all these sort of things, they should be living in terrible conditions. I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about some criminals, and I love researching criminals and finding out what happened to them really after their sentences were served, or to see how their life pans out really. So I'm concentrating particularly on the area around Douglas Harbour. It's difficult studying crime in lots of ways because I tend to look at the individuals. There are no real crime statistics as such created by the constabulary until an awful lot later. But this case here is of an 11-year-old girl who's called Emma Quayle. Thankfully, I'm pleased to tell you she didn't go to jail. The publican of the Market Hotel found 11-year-old Emma trying to open the till. Her father, a fella called Daniel Quayle, was buried at Braddon just before Christmas. He was only 36. Emma was tempted by the till, and apparently she'd taken 7 shillings on an occasion before. When Emma was baptised in 1872, her father was listed as being a butcher, but here you can see in the 1881 census, 2 years before the crime, she is listed as 9 years of age. At the address at 14 Bond Street, there are 11 adults and 5 children living there. I'm not sure which house it was or what size the house was, but by anyone's standards, that's pretty overcrowded. Emma went on to marry in 1890, 9 years after the census and 7 years after the theft. And she married just before she was 18 years of age, because you can see she's described as a minor when she marries. She died 4 years later after this, in August 1893, and was buried at Braddon with no headstone. Basically, I think a short and grim life. Her husband remarried the following year. So the poor girl wasn't really even mourned for any length of time. So this is how people disappear from the records. Other types of unworthies can be described as the drunk. We're looking at this area of Douglas again. It's interesting to note this area by the harbour in Douglas. It's surprising to me when you look at the amount of, there's a Wesleyan Chapel, there's a Temperance Hall, all of these organisations, of course, that promote abstaining from alcohol. They would have had their work cut out in Douglas. I'd assumed that temperance hotels would be a force for good, but this is not necessarily the case. You'll see this letter here from the Manx Sun. He says, basically, he's slagging off Belvedere Temperance Hotel, owned by Mr. Cowan, basically calling it a brothel. And he says that basically he's describing how if you have a licensed premises, you have to be proved to be a fit person, but any old person could have a temperance hotel, and they're not necessarily a fantastic thing. And this opinion is endorsed by policemen in every British town. But please observe Mr. Cowan, because his name will come up again. This is the same area of Douglas, and we think this photograph is from about the 1880s. It is, the newspaper article is about some women who were arrested for fighting. I've chosen this image because we know that one of the women who was fighting, she was called Emily Christian, and she worked at the Cattle Market Inn in 1891, which is the photograph shows the back of the Cattle Market Inn. We know that she worked there because she's mentioned as a witness when a horse and cart was stolen from there. Another lady on this this newspaper cutting, Isabella McKechnie, I know quite a bit about her, but she was a prostitute as well. It's quite interesting to note that prostitution wasn't actually illegal, but prostitutes tended to be arrested for frequenting, which is basically hanging about, breaching the peace, fighting, and for being drunk. Isabella, that I mentioned, she eventually died in the Poor Asylum as time went by. Emily Christian appears in Castle Rushen records twice, and I followed her story through. In the year she was arrested, she lived at 32 Barrack Street with her husband Robert, who was a general labourer. She was 29 and he was 22. They were both born in Douglas. There were no children of the marriage, but Anne Kelly, Robert's mother-in-law, was living with them. She was aged 56. Therefore, we have very approximate dates of birth, and we know that most likely Emily's maiden name was Kelly, or Emily's mother may have remarried a Kelly. And as you lot know, Kellys and Christians, they're the hardest to research. It's interesting to note in the jail records available on iMuseum that Emily seems to quite like gruel, because she's 11.2 on arrival and she's 11.7 when she's discharged. I couldn't find a birth for her, so I started looking around to see if I could find her in any other records, and I found her death. Her death certificate shows that she died from primary intestinal obstruction, bronchitis, secondary heart failure as well. I was hoping to find a maiden name, but I have her husband's name confirmed. And I noticed that her husband was not present at the death, but her friend Jane Cowan, who lived at Hardy's Cottages, which is the photograph there, she was present, and she was a woman who was unable to sign her name. And this is an example, again, of another short and really, really brutal life for people who lived in Douglas, really. Alcohol abuse was a massive problem in Douglas. And I'm struck by the juxtaposition of the fine ladies and gentlemen there promenading on Douglas Head, and then the stews, basically, of the rough old bits of Douglas down below that we've just looked at. Nowadays, rough sleepers and beggars are still associated with alcohol abuse, but nowadays, different to back then, we have drugs to add to the complex causes of rough sleeping. A group of people that often are marginalised are the mentally ill, and I wrote a dissertation about this. The asylum was opened on the Isle of Man in 1868, which was woefully behind the rest of Britain. And it makes me very, very cross that the Isle of Man, we have the opportunity to be so groundbreaking in many ways, but we just really aren't, and we're still not. There was pressure put on the Manx government to do something about mental illness, because people were either locked up in Castle Rushen, dumped in Liverpool, or they were locked in sheds and barns. So something had to be done. So the dissertation that I wrote was about unmarried mothers, were they locked up or not? I looked at women abusing alcohol. I looked to see whether women were locked up to prevent men from syphilis, which they were. I first came across Abdullah Quilliam because one of the clearly mentally unwell women claimed to be one of his wives. And I also found lots of cases of women with learning disabilities. And there was one very sad case in particular where a young girl, a 13-year-old, was taken to the asylum. And when she was admitted, her mother explained, she said that she was unable to control her at home, and she fears she will be taken advantage of by some unscrupulous man. So basically there, the girl with learning disabilities was put in the asylum to stop men from abusing her. I could talk all night about the links between mental illness, poverty, learning disabilities, abuse and crime, but that's kind of another talk. But I just wanted to touch on it because it's important. Let's turn to another marginalised group, gypsies. The first real evidence of Romani folk on the Isle of Man is in the 1860s. Walter W. Gill, or W. Walter Gill, I should say, wrote an article in the Journal of Gypsy Law in 1836. I must confess I am fascinated by gypsies, partly because my own Manx grandmother was quite dark-skinned, and also because they seem to be one of the last minorities where people think it's okay to sneer at them. So I don't know if you know Tyson Fury. He's the most famous person at the moment. People think it's fine just to say horrible things about him. But mainly I'm interested in gypsies because of the work of George Borrow. And here's a picture of him here. I first came across Borrow because of his travels around the Isle of Man. He studied languages. He was given a Manx carvel by the Boyd family at Glendu and Ballaugh. His papers were sold after his death, and the carvel eventually returned to the island and is now in the Manx Museum. George Borrow is still admired for his inspirational writings on gypsies and for his description of England in around the 1820s and of Wales in the 1850s. His writings are journeys interspersed with travellers' tales and strange encounters in taverns and hostelries along the way. He didn't have a university education, but he was a very talented linguist. He wasn't concerned with perfecting his knowledge of any language, but with collecting some knowledge of a large number. And there is evidence that he could either speak or write up to 100 languages, which includes Manx. When he visited here in 1855, he produced 2 notebooks and probably intended to write a book, but unfortunately it came to nothing. In 1869, Walter Gill, as I described, found notice of an affray which took place just outside the town of Douglas, and it was recorded in the highway accounts. And these here are the gypsy names that he found. These gypsy names included Heron and Young as well. The families were well known for travelling northern England, organising public dances, and they worked trading. On the Isle of Man, they rarely tramped the countryside, selling baskets and brooms and pegs like they often did in England, but they preferred to stay around Douglas, and they lived in hooped red tents. Gill has them camping at Todd's Lane off Ballaquail Road and also at Little Switzerland, and of course on Onchan and Douglas Heads. So I'm going to tell you a bit about these gypsy folk. So, Frederick Boswell was a very talented man. He was known as King Fred, and although he was short in stature, he wore fancy waistcoats and a half-top hat. Apparently, he was a brilliant step dancer and a brilliant fiddler. Gill says he was fond of a scrap, and the possession of a remarkably attractive wife gave him plenty of practice. He bred horses at Richmond Hill, and he was very clever at repairing machinery and was reputed to be the first person to drive a carriage using 4 horses around the Isle of Man for the benefit of tourists. Gill also says Fred was happy to travel back and forth to his native Sheffield. His wife Harriet had been so seasick on her initial crossing to the Isle of Man that she vowed never to leave the island again. His wife Harriet was very talented in the art of what they call duckering or fortune telling. The descendants of this family include a Manx beauty queen, dancers and bandmasters, and the Café Royal on the King Edward Road overlooking Onchan Harbour was built for a Mrs. Harriet Hart in 1924, who was Frederick's great granddaughter. So you can see this is a picture of Douglas Head, and this is the gypsy encampment up there where they had their red hoop tents and they did their fortune telling for tourists. So their son, Tommy, there is a folklife excerpt about him, and I'm just going to read that out. There was open ground behind the prison, and Tommy Boswell used to have his camp there. He was a trucker and general dealer. In the summer he had a 4 in hand and used to be taking people out around the island on sightseeing trips. There were 2 tents where he had his camping ground, just to cover on a kind of framework of sticks or wood. There was a woman there too, a Mrs. Kelly. Outside one of the tents he had a fire in a bucket. Boswell was a rough character, was getting old and going grey. He used to be up the Douglas Head Road. He was camping up there too. We know that he married a lady called Christina Corkle, who was a farmer's daughter, and there's a picture of her there that I nicked off Ancestry, as you can do. There is a rumour that she actually had Romani blood in her from her mother, which I've not been able to find out anything else about. So the next slide is a little bit about their activities. So in 1896, Tommy was in trouble for threatening a fella called John Duff, who owed him money. Boswell went to Duff's house and was said to have picked up a bread knife from the table and chased Duff up the stairs. The charge was later withdrawn, but Tommy said he'd heard Duff was about to leave the island. He did admit he'd been getting ready for a fight and had brought some of his family with him, which is a bit scary. This other article is about a new law that came into force in 1896 called the Vagrancy Act, and it also banned fortune telling. And by this point, 2 policemen had been up Douglas Head pretending to be holidaymakers in order to entrap the gypsies. The High Bailiff says, and I'll quote again, "Up to that time, what are called gypsy encampments have been left in the island without molestation or annoyance to any individuals to my knowledge." The High Bailiff had had trouble getting a hold of the copy of the Act himself, so he was not sure that the Boswells were aware of the change in the law. And as they promised to give up fortune telling, he let them off. But it's interesting that there's evidence there that the Romani folk weren't really discriminated against or picked on in any way on the Isle of Man. The Boswells later lived at 16 Head Road, as you can see in the photograph there, finally embracing bricks and mortar. Tommy was a wonderful dancer like his father, and Walter Gill wrote that with one of his sisters he led the opening dance of the dance hall at Derby Castle in 1877, and he died in October 1920. And this is the story of what happened to him. About midnight, he was seen making his way home along the harbour, singing happily. When he came to where the wall is replaced by a chain, he overbalanced and fell into 8 feet of water and was drowned before he could be rescued. Poor fella. I have met 3 people on the Isle of Man who claim descent from Romani families. Their ancestors became involved in the scrap metal and salvage trades, typical sort of Romani activities. One man I met told me how careful his grandfather had been to see identification when buying goods offered to him, and he kept meticulous records, having had his collar felt by the long arm of the law in over a previous purchase of lead. The archives contain reminiscences of a lady called Lillian Marion, who grew up in a boarding house at Hutchison Square, and she describes Douglas Head, and she said, "For years on that spot there was a long red tent that housed a gypsy family, and if I remember rightly, their name was Osborne. They told fortunes to all who either believed them or were out for a little fun. The red colour made it very noticeable and added charm and gaiety to a lovely bit of Douglas." The fella on the screen here is a fella called Jim Cam, who rented a farm at Thallivale near St Mark's, and he moved here from across and was famous for the models that he made. But I just want you to think, when you look at Douglas Head now, I just want you to think of, what it was like in the day with different people living there. Another marginalised group are people of colour. Now, in my work at Manx National Heritage, I accession a lot of photographs, and people of colour are pretty much non-existent. I suppose the most famous person of colour is James Brown, the newspaper editor. It's said that he had been descended from a man who fought at Trafalgar, but there's no evidence for this. It seems from his marriage in 1832 in Liverpool that his father had been a blacksmith called Daniel. It's kind of ironic too that James Brown doesn't appear in A.W. Moore's Manx Worthies, and that's because he wasn't Manx born, not because of the colour of his skin. The most visible people of colour in the Manx records are not actually people of colour, they're minstrels who are blacked up. I think we probably recall minstrels still being quite high profile in the 1970s on the telly. With the Isle of Man's seafaring heritage and links with slavery, it seems highly unlikely the only black person was a slave buried at Braddon called Samuel Alley. Some images of Foxdale Mining School show some other people who aren't white Caucasians, but I remain on the lookout for anybody of a different colour. Here we see Mr. Hemming's minstrels, and with, I quote, genuine Negroes. The other newspaper article is about a man touting for business. His worship says, "Is that the natural colour of his face? That's a pity. It would have saved you much trouble," he says to him. But really, he was in trouble not for being pretending to be black, but for touting for business. So, talking of James Brown, here it is James Brown's son receiving a bit of racial abuse. James Cowan, town councillor and hotelier of the Belvedere that we talked about before, was a fierce opponent of John Archibald Brown and his use of the press, which Cowan believed was very self-promoting, basically using his own newspapers to further his own business dealings and his own political ambitions. And he also, Brown was involved with the Manx syndicate as well, of course. In the letter here, you see that the writer, who's called Anti-Humbug, discusses the controversy, and he says, "Douglas much prefer a minstrel entertainment to a pantomime, and that if Mr. Brown had the audacity to publicly state that he would aspire to be mayor, we will never, I hope, so far forget ourselves and our loyalty and patriotism as to ask a native of Afric's sunny fountains to act in that capacity. No, as long as water runs and grass grows, for as it has recently been stated, the truth is that God never yet lit the flame of a great soul in a dark lantern." Oh, this is not good, is it? However, Mr. Cowan, of the brothel fame, objects most strongly here in this other letter on the right-hand side, and he distances himself from this type of language. And he says, there are plenty of vulnerable places in his skin to pierce, over which he has had no control and could have averted without falling back upon race or colour. So he goes on to say, had Mr. Brown's face been as white as his character and reputation ought to be, as one who has been conducting of a newspaper and who is expected to be pure, unselfish, noble in thought, aiming at the elevation of the people, free from participation in speculations and ennobled with a desire for the political, moral and religious uplifting of the people, he would indeed have been useful. I like to think it's a bit odd that they expect newspaper men to be so virtuous. Anyway, he says, John A. Brown dominates, has for years dominated the public life of this island. James Brown, the father of this degenerate son, never, to my knowledge, used his paper for personal and selfish purposes, like it has been in Mr. J.A. Brown's day. So it's good to see Cowan there, sticking to his core criticisms and not resorting to any kind of racial attack. So, more Unworthies. Let's talk now about homosexuality and gay people. So the term homosexuality was first used in 1869 in Hungary and was used initially as a medical term. It was much debated and analysed by psychiatrists and was seen as a disorder until 1974. God. I wanted to find out if there was any evidence in Manx records. And having assumed that although homosexuality would be underground, somewhere there must be a mention. Somewhere there must. I learned that the first English case dealing with matters relating to homosexuality to be covered in the mainstream newspapers was not until 1871. Two young men, here they are, were arrested for wearing ladies' clothes and thus causing public outrage, and they were suspected of sodomy, although both were later acquitted, because they couldn't prove that any sex acts had taken place because they had not been caught in the act, and dressing as a woman was not in itself illegal. I was kicking myself because it took me so long to find this article, and then I realised why. It's because the charge is misdemeanour. In the Isle of Man Times it said, the trial of Boulton and Park was conducted on Monday. The prosecution altogether broke down and the defendants were found not guilty on all accounts relative to the charge of conspiracy, and the Chief Justice occupied 3 hours in his charge to the jury, who deliberated on the evidence for an hour and then returned to the court with a verdict of no, not guilty. I hadn't missed this homosexuality in the papers because I hadn't looked hard enough, but it's because the modern terminology was not there. So, having done some further reading, it seems that even they reckon that Oscar Wilde had escaped censure before his trial because his contemporaries had no idea how a homosexual man should look or act. I ended up getting really fascinated by these two, and I read a book about these two who called themselves Fanny and Stella, and it opened my eyes to some of the behaviours around Theatreland in London, which were obviously completely different to anything happening in the Isle of Man. But it was quite telling that some of the national newspapers were very reticent to report some of the hijinks that were going on in the metropolis. Basically, Fanny and Stella were entrapped, and there was no doubt that their behaviour in London was outrageous. But there wasn't the mechanism to convict them of anything without them being caught in the act. Homosexuality remained illegal until 1967 in England and Wales and 1980 in Scotland. And of course, the Manx were embarrassingly behind the times yet again. We're terrible, we are. Really. So these two actually appeared on the Isle of Man. They performed over here. And so we found notice of them in the newspapers. I'm pretty sure they must have pretty much behaved themselves while they were on the Isle of Man. Okay, so I did much searching, and in the digitised newspapers and everywhere, and I couldn't find anyone being prosecuted for homosexuality or anything who looked like it until I came across this article. And I had high hopes when I came across 18-year-old James Doran, mentioned in the newspapers in 1869. And he was, you can see, he was charged with committing a filthy and unnatural offence in the neighbourhood of Ramsey. There we go. And I looked and I saw this in the government officer's papers. He was accused of committing an unnatural act with a male. I thought, right, here we go. Finally, we found some hidden intrigue in the papers. I found records of his parents, James and Rose, visiting him in Castle Rushen, and I was intrigued because he was actually sentenced to transportation, which seems awfully late, but it seems that transportation by this time had been stopped, and his sentence was converted into a sentence of 14 years of penal servitude, and he was sent to Portsea in Hampshire. I did a bit more digging and found the court records. Here they are. I photographed them at the Public Record Office, but when I read the evidence, I discovered that I'd made a mistake. He wasn't committed for carrying out an unnatural act with a male. It was an unnatural act with a mule. His father's evidence basically concentrated about on the horse being very bad-tempered, which is not really surprising, and apparently prone to kicking. It seems that James returned home to the Isle of Man from jail by 1881, and I think he died quite young, aged about the age of 31, buried in Macclesfield in 1883. I was thinking of ordering a death certificate, but I decided that as an animal lover, I wasn't going to follow him up any further. I found absolutely no evidence in the records of women being queer. But of course, if you were female and you had a female companion, there was nothing unusual in that in any way. So I think it's highly unlikely I'm ever going to find anything, but I will keep looking. My next group of unworthies are Jews, and I'm very happy to say I found no evidence of any anti-Semitism in the Manx records at all. What you would expect in the newspapers was basically tourist stuff about Jewish people running on holiday, and also Jewish people, running businesses. So one excerpt I did find relating to Jewish people on the Isle of Man, I'm just going to read you, and it's from High Bailiff Lawton's reminiscences. Okay, and I am coming to a close with this. One day, a witness in a case before him stepped into the witness box with his hat on his head, which at first rather staggered his Honour's notions of seemliness. He demanded the reason for this apparent disrespect and was informed that the man was a Jew and required to be sworn in on the Old instead of the New Testament. The Deemster accordingly ordered the constable, Lys Clucas, to bring an Old Testament from the adjoining room. Lys at once proceeded, with great respect, to obey the Deemster's order and, returning, handed to the Jew a book which seemed to be in a very torn and dirty condition, the back being completely torn off. The witness took the book in his hand, and being evidently of a suspicious nature, he opened it, and finding it to be another New Testament, began in a very angry tone to protest against this seeming deception being practised upon him. The book was handed up to the judge, who, finding that it was as the Jew alleged, commenced to lecture the constable for his stupidity. Lys gravely replied that he really thought that the testament was quite old enough. At any rate, it was the oldest he could find. So, in conclusion, I think that it's interesting to revisit the past and have a look at things with some fresh eyes, and to see how much things have changed or not, as the case may be. I tried to see how visible stigmatised people and unworthies were in the records, in some cases not very. And also wanted to reflect on where about on the Isle of Man these people would be hanging around. And I think my results were basically that poverty, begging, crime and drunkenness were all pretty high profile on the Isle of Man. It was all visible, it was all out there, everyone could see it. And that begging was accepted by the Manx in general, and also that gypsies were accepted too. Discrimination against people from colour is pretty much hidden too, but homosexuality remains hidden in the records. But on the Isle of Man, there are to be found evidence of beggars' houses, poor houses. There's obviously the asylum, the prison. And I want you to think, when you look at Douglas Head, I want you to think of the gypsy camping grounds. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at the stigmatised and the more troublesome population of the Isle of Man in the Victorian period. And I'm heading back out to Douglas after this to stick a road cone on T. Brown's head. There we go.